Hello, just gonna wait one more moment. Okay, I'm going to begin. I'm Esti Marcus, licensed clinical social worker. I specialize in trauma and have a private practice in Brooklyn and these days online as well. And tonight's topic is IFS and somatic therapy. IFS, it's becoming pretty well known these days, and it stands for internal family systems. So I'm going to be talking a little bit about internal family systems and why it's used, how it's used, the benefits of it, and also about somatic therapy, somatic experiencing therapy, or sensory motor psychotherapy, which are both somatic approaches in therapy, and why they often go hand in hand, somatic approaches and IFS. So I want to begin tonight's talk by basically defining the goal of life. I know that's a big task to do, but one approach for understanding the goal of our lives is to take responsibility, to be able to be responsible for our lives. And if we understand the goal of our lives to be taking responsibility for our lives, the goal then of childhood is to prepare an individual for taking responsibility for their lives. So in childhood, we learn and get nurtured in all the ways to take responsibility, with the hope, and in an ideal world, by the time we're ready to enter into adulthood, we have developed capacity to take responsibility for our lives, and then we live our lives and take responsibility. Now, I just want to clarify that when I say taking responsibility, I mean it literally, like the ability to respond. And the goal of our childhood, and also most of our lives, is to continue to develop our ability to respond to all the circumstances that arise in our lives. And of course, therefore, if we didn't get what we needed in childhood, if for whatever reason, sometimes it's neglect, sometimes it's life circumstances, sometimes there's interrupted abilities to really develop our capacity for taking responsibility, that's often what brings people in for therapy, where they can then learn in therapy to take responsibility. What are the two main factors, two main components for developing an ability to take responsibility, or an ability to be responsive? There are two main components that need to be present. One is consciousness, and two is leadership. Consciousness is our ability to be aware of what's happening, both inside and outside of ourselves. If we don't have consciousness, we can't really do much. We can't really take action. So being aware of what's happening inside, being aware of what's happening in our environment, is a really important step for taking responsibility. But consciousness is not enough, because I think we can all know of people who may have a lot of self-awareness. They have a lot of consciousness of what's going on. They can talk a lot about what the problems are, and they're very aware of it. But it's not consciousness alone that gets us to take responsibility. It's also leadership. Leadership, our ability to lead ourselves, to take the steps of being responsive, leadership outside of ourselves, that is like the key for being able to be responsive. So those two components need to be here and developed in order for us to be able to develop an ability to respond to life situations and circumstances. Now, if we're also understanding that the main goal of our lives is to take responsibility, that also means that we were designed with the capacity to take responsibility, to have all the qualities, all the leadership qualities that are needed in order to be able to take responsibility. Now, so we're all born with those qualities. We're designed that way, just like we are designed with the capacity to breathe and eat and heal our wounds, both physical and emotional. We are also born with leadership qualities, or the capacity to develop those leadership qualities, so that we have the tools that are needed to live our lives the way that we are meant to. And some of those leadership qualities are in IFS. In the IFS community, we're often very aware that it happens to be that a lot of these qualities begin with the letter C. I don't know why it developed that way, but that's just an easier way to remember it. But a lot of those leadership qualities begin with a C, like curiosity, compassion, connection, an ability to be calm, and of course, one of the most prominent and important qualities is courage, the courage to actually take action. So all of those qualities are things that we have the capacity for, and that with nurturance and development, we can both develop our sense of consciousness as well as our ability to be a leader, both of ourselves, and if the environment calls for it, to be leaders of others. And the other piece here to be aware of is that when I talk about consciousness, anything that we may not be aware of, but then become aware of, goes from unconscious to conscious. And we can only be responsive to the things that are conscious to us, which is how mistakes work, right? A lot of times we make mistakes, it's because there's some piece of information that is not in our consciousness. Then we take action and we find out that there was something missing that wasn't in our consciousness, but because of the mistake, it now became part of our consciousness. And now we have the ability to learn from it. And that's why mistakes are such an inherent part of being able to take responsibility and live a fulfilling life. So one of the why am I talking about responsibility, leadership, and consciousness? It's because one of the goals and abilities, why IFS is so effective, IFS, Internal Family Systems, is so effective at being helpful to develop a sense of responsibility, is because it addresses both of these components at the same time. It both helps bring what's unconscious to the consciousness, and it helps develop and nurture a sense of self-leadership. And that's why I think, it kind of ends up speaking for itself, like something that ends up becoming pretty popular. It's because it works, and because people feel like it really helps them make change and take the steps with courage and compassion to themselves and to others as well. So I want to get a little bit deeper into it and about IFS. And so an example, so the way that I like to conceptualize it, internal family systems is set up as like a family system, and just like in a family system, there are different parts. There's siblings or different children, and sometimes there's a family that's not like an organic kind of family. It's just like a family of friends or a family of community. Often there are different parts with different roles, and then there's a leader that kind of brings it all together. And a leaderless system is a dysfunctional system. Just like if there's a family that doesn't really have a leader, it's basically a dysfunctional family. If there's a government that has a lot of different moving parts, but there's no leader with leadership material of the government, it's a functional government. And And the same thing goes with our internal system, that if we are we have this big organism, this big mass of different systems and energies and components going on. And this system that we are as human beings needs a leader. And without a leader, there's just different parts running the show at different times. And we can all imagine we don't even have to imagine, we can just think about experiences where in government or in families or even with ourselves, if there are just like choices being made here and there without a leader to check in with or consult with, or who can oversee the whole picture, it can be pretty chaotic and dysfunctional. And that's often what brings people in for therapy when they have experienced the symptoms of different parts running the show of their lives and no sense of grounded leadership within their system. So one of the reasons why it can be so chaotic and dysfunctional when parts are running the show rather than there being a leader running the show or taking responsibility is because each part that we have in our internal system holds the experience of that particular part. For example, let's say we have an experience, a wound that develops, an experience of being misattuned to numerous times without any repair. So the wound is an experience of shame or aloneness that happens over the course of childhood, for example. And that is a really painful wound that needs to be protected. So a protective part develops at that time, and I'm making this motion, I don't know if you could see. So here's the wound, and a protective part develops to try to protect against that wound so that that wound is not exposed over and over again. So the protective parts that end up developing, they develop in childhood often, or they kind of develop almost at the same time that the wound happened. So if the wound happened at age 5, often the protector develops at age 5. Sometimes it develops a little bit later when there's been many experiences of the wound. But the protective part is very young and really stays in that developmental state throughout your life until you can connect to it and update it. So we have, let's say, a 5-year-old wound, and then we have a protective part that also develops around the same time. So maybe this protective part is 6 years old, and this 6-year-old part holds the entire experience of all the pain that happened to this 5-year-old. And that part at capacity holds the entire experience of that wound that it developed around. And that means that this protective part has a tremendous amount of information and insight to be able to offer us as the adult about the wounded experience of the 5-year-old. But what this one part does not have the capacity for is to be able to share the experience of the whole childhood, of the whole life. It's also not able to see all the moving parts because it holds the experience of just that one wound. The leader, ideally the leader that's in our core self that we talked about that has those qualities, that leader has the capacity to hold all of the experiences. So to think about it like this trunk, like this core trunk of a tree with different branches coming out and different parts, and each branch holds a different experience, maybe a different wound, a different role, a different protector, but they're not talking to each other. Like each part doesn't know what the other part's experience is. So you might have one part that's in charge of protecting you by repressing whatever emotion comes up. So that's how it's protecting you against the pain. And it holds all experience about how painful it would be to express, and therefore it wants you to repress. But then you have another part that holds all the experience of aloneness and what happens when you repress, and all it wants to do is get you to express. And so if only one part at a time is running the show, only one need is being met, and only one experience is being heard. The goal of internal family systems, and really the goal of all therapy, but it's just set up in a very organized way in internal family systems, is to help this core, to help each of us get in touch with our core internal self, the leadership part, and have all the different parts connect and talk to this core leader. And so maybe the part that holds the wound of being misunderstood, that wants you to repress, is talking to you and telling you about the experience and really wants you to stop communicating, hold back from communicating. And maybe the part that has been longing for connection and knows that the only way to really connect is to express and wants you to just say everything that's on your mind. That part is also talking to the leader. And then the leader also has awareness of all the other circumstances that are going on outside of herself and maybe inside of herself, and the past and the future and the cognitive brain and the emotional brain. So the leader gets to have access to all of these parts, takes in all the information, and then says, okay, here's what we're going to do. We're going to make this decision because it'll really address multiple needs at the same time, and it's the most effective way of doing, of approaching this problem. And then there's a sense of calm and a sense of trust that develops in the system, because all these parts are now under the leadership of a competent, compassionate, courageous, connecting leader. And so that's the ultimate goal of really all therapy, and especially internal family systems. Now, why does this often go hand in hand with somatic approaches? And I think there are many different answers, but I'm just going to focus on one answer. The reason why is because in order for parts to be listened to, like if there is no leader, think about a system that doesn't have a leader, like a dysfunctional family or a dysfunctional government or a dysfunctional community. And oftentimes the internet or social media is an example of a dysfunctional community because it doesn't really have a leader on social media. So there's different people and different opinions screaming out and trying to get everyone to listen to them, to their approach, to their needs. And that's exactly what's happening internally. There's a part that really wants to be listened to and feels really passionate about her experience of needing to protect against something, and starts kind of screaming and yelling. Sometimes it uses a lot of different methods. Sometimes it uses, fear. Sometimes it uses storytelling. That's a very common approach that parts use to try to uses whatever tools are at her disposal to try to get the different parts on board to listen to that part. And that takes a lot of energy. It requires screaming, it requires cajoling, it requires coercing sometimes, it requires manipulation and strategizing, and it's exhausting, and again, takes a lot of energy. As opposed to when there's a leader, and when there's trust in the leader, and there's an awareness that there's a leader that will take into account all the important data, there's no need to scream. Then there's like a sense of relaxing where, okay, there's a problem. I'm just going to go to the leader. I'm going to express myself to the leader, and I'm going to be heard, and they're going to help me figure out, and they're going to help the whole system figure out what the best approach is. And of course, in an ideal family system, That's what happens. Children maybe are struggling with something. They go to the leader. They go and also ideally there's a partnership that's at the head of the family. So there's two leaders, or maybe sometimes there's a whole village that raises a family, but there also needs to be leaders in charge. So a leader that the different children can ideally come to and express themselves, be heard, and then take into account the whole family and the individual and what is needed, and makes decisions that way. So the idea is that when parts have been running the show for a long time, and when there's been a lot of trauma or reasons for protective parts to develop and then take over the decision making, it requires a lot of energy. And so the idea in somatic experiencing or somatic approaches in therapy is to help discharge or release the stuck energy in the system. When there's stuck energy in the system that has been like kind of overused, I like to think of it as like the engine's on, but the brake is, the car is in park, the engine's on, and you're pushing on the gas, you're pushing on the gas, you're pushing on the gas. It ends up flooding the car with a lot of gas in the system. So it's similar to our internal system, where there's a part that's very active and it's pushing the gas, pushing the gas, pushing the gas. Sometimes it gets to get the system to listen to it, because a lot of times the parts can be very persuasive, and then we make decisions that don't really work for the whole system. They only work for parts of a system, and it creates a sense of unsafety. So then there's a lot of leftover energy in our system that causes ailments sometimes. Sometimes it causes stress or pain in the system. And sometimes it causes repetition, where we just like, this is what happens every single time this particular juncture, this particular set of circumstances happen. We just respond the same way, because that's where the energy automatically flows to. So it's hard to then make change. So using somatic approaches to kind of integrate or blend in with IFS is a really helpful way of discharging all that stuck energy that gets flooded into the system when parts are running the show. There's a lot more that I have to say about IFS and somatic approaches. I think it's pretty clear that I feel very passionate about how effective and helpful they can be at developing self-leadership, which is something that I'm really passionate about, helping develop self-leadership in my clients and, of course, in myself. But we are kind of almost out of time. I want to go over some of the questions, and then I will have to stop for tonight, but maybe we can do another session if there are more questions. The first question that I see here is, what does IFS therapy look like? So I didn't really address that in this talk, like what it looks like in a session. Typically, I think that it looks different, and sometimes, especially like a therapist like me, I integrate a lot of different approaches. So I'll pull from IFS while I'm doing somatic work, and a lot of other and relational work and psychodynamics. So I'll pull from a lot of different places. So I think it looks different depending on the therapist, depending on the client, depending on what's coming up in the session. But I can give you like a rough framework for how it works. Is often someone will come in with something that they're either conflicted about or they're feeling stuck in. Maybe it's a decision that they feel stuck, or a repetition, like a repetitive decision that they're not happy with, or again, a sense of conflict, like they're not sure. And then we start exploring, like, what do you notice coming up? A lot of times there's a protective response where there's a part that doesn't want to do something because they're afraid. So I'll ask a question like, what is this part afraid of, and it's just developing a deeper understanding for what the part wants, what you want, and developing a connection between what the part is saying and what the leader, what the individual, what the self energy would say. I want to just add one more piece here. There's an approach that I've recently been trained in. It's called presence psychotherapy, and it integrates spirituality into the healing of trauma, and it really blends spirituality with IFS, and I think it's just like a perfect integration model that I have found to be extremely effective. If you're interested in that, you can reach out to me. It's a really beautiful enhanced way of using internal family systems and integrating spirituality and like a bigger relational container. The second question I have here is, what's the difference between IFS and somatic therapy? Why are they often going hand in hand? So I think I did address that one answer of why they go hand in hand is because somatic approaches help address the stuck energy that comes from parts running the show. The difference between IFS and somatic therapy is that IFS often has more of like the story and the emotion and the understanding of what's happening. Somatic approaches don't need the story or don't need the understanding. It really can focus just sensationally and experientially, like what's happening in the body. And that's a very effective way sometimes of facilitating healing when there is a proclivity towards shame. Last question is, does the therapist touch the client in somatic therapy, and if so, why? That the answer to that is it depends. Not every therapist is certified to be able to touch in therapy or trained, and the reason why there is sometimes touch, and of course there's only touch with consent and with a lot of sensitivity to what you're coming in for and what's needed, but there's certain healing that can really be sped up or expedited through touch, and like, you know, calming touch to the base of the head, sometimes soothing with like an embrace. It's obviously non-sexual touch and just healing touch, like chiropractor or massage therapy or some kind of touch therapy that just helps integrate a lot of different approaches. I do have to stop for tonight. I'm sorry it's been a little bit rushed. If you have any more questions, feel free to reach out to me at Esti Marcus LCSW. I'm on Instagram, or you could send me an email. Okay, have a good night.